Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. I think it was last week, I talked about dealing with various negative mind states, including fear. And I'd like to look at the other side of that today and talk about the virtue and importance of courage, sura, that is definitely required for progress on the path. One of the attributes or qualities of an arahant is fearlessness, abhaya. That arahant is completely beyond fear. And the possession of or practice of courage is a step towards arahantship. The goal is not for the faint of heart. It requires that boldness to confront obstacles. The Buddha himself, as a historical person, Siddhartha Gautama, he was born into the Khattiya clan or Khattiya caste, which in Indian society was the caste of warrior nobles. So we see in a lot of his metaphors and similes, we can see his background. He often uses imagery of chariots or elephants, war elephants, so on. This was, you know, this was the cultural matrix he came out of. The image of a chariot, there's one very elaborated metaphor for the chariot where the two steeds, the horses that are pulling the chariot, are faith and wisdom, and the rider is the mind, and the reins are hiriotapa, and so on. And there's many every detail breakdown of the chariot, and the axle is jhana. I think in some quarters in modern times we get a image of Buddhism and Buddhists as being kind of a soft approach. And that's really not traditional at all. If we look at any tradition in Buddhism, the heroes, the great monks and teachers often uh, demonstrate a great deal of courage in the face of difficulties and adversity. We have monks who undertook great perilous journeys like Bodhidharma, going from India to China through the wild Himalayas. In Ajahn Mun's biography, there's a story of a monk who went to India, walked from Thailand to India, and World War II broke out while he was in India, and he walked back to Thailand through British-held territory and was almost killed as a spy because Thailand, of course, was on the Axis side. Well, he was captured by British soldiers and they were going to kill him. He just practiced loving kindness and disarmed the soldiers. They didn't have the heart to shoot him. And this illustrates the practice of the Brahma Viharas, loving kindness and compassion. if they're done to a high level, that also requires a great deal of courage. I read about a Tibetan monk who was in a Chinese concentration camp, was abused and tortured in various ways for several years. And the interviewer asked him, "Were you afraid at any time?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I was afraid. Uh, I was constantly afraid that their abuse would make me lose my heart of loving kindness." The second noble truth, the root of suffering or the cause of suffering in the three kinds of tanha, also illustrates a point that overcoming overcoming the kinds of tanha requires courage. That succumbing to tanha is really an act of cowardice. The first kind of tanha is kama tanha, sensual desire. And there is an element of cowardice in relying on sense desires as a false refuge, clinging to the near shore. That overcoming kama tanha allows one to cross the stream, to come to the far shore. I'll illustrate this idea with a personal anecdote. There was a place I stayed in Thailand where I was staying in a kuti up on a hill, and I had to walk down to the eating sala every day. And at one point on the path, there was a creek. And most of the time, it was very shallow, just barely above my ankles, and I could just wade across easily. But after monsoon rain, it would go into flood for the next day, and it was often up over my waist or more. And it took me exactly 3 steps to cross the stream. On the first step, I could hold onto a branch on the near shore and keep my balance. And on the third step, I could grab a branch on the far side to pull myself up. But there was one step where I had to step without any support across this fast-moving, deep stream of water without tumbling, and I had no support. And it's like that with the path and abandoning the refuge of the near shore. As long as we're clinging to the near shore, we can't reach the far shore. And we have to take that step. And that takes a great deal of courage, and it takes more courage than the physical case of walking across that stream, because I could see the opposite shore, and I knew it was just one step. But you have to practice this radical letting go, this abandonment. And this shows up in small ways, like people who have difficulty in meditation because of bodily discomfort. That everybody, when they start to meditate, their common theme that they have to deal with is pains in the body, just because they're not used to sitting still, and the dukkha of the body becomes evident. And you get over that not when the body stops hurting, although that may come eventually. You get over it when you just don't let it bother you anymore. Oh, this is the body. It hurts. That's what it does. Okay, never mind. No. And that requires a certain degree of courage. But the attachment to sense desires, although at our level as human beings it's the noisiest, most clamorous of the forms of desire, it's the most obvious and evident, it's relatively superficial. Beneath and more fundamental, more deeply rooted in our beings are the desire for existence and the desire for non-existence, bhavatana, vibhavatana. And we alternate between the two. Bhavatanha, at the simplest level, is simply the desire to exist, the desire to be, but it manifests in daily life as a desire to be more than you are, to be somehow greater, you know, bigger, more powerful, more influential, more popular, whatever. The other form of vibhava tanha, the desire not to be, in an extreme case, it's a desire for self-annihilation. But on a more daily, mundane level, it's the desire to be less than you are, which manifests in everybody in different ways from time to time. Just the desire to sort of throttle consciousness down to a lower level. People resort to drink and drugs, or vegging out in front of the TV. Oversleeping is a very common one. Oversleeping, just generally encouraging a dullness of mind. And to be able to let go of both of these poles, to desire neither to be nor not to be, takes a tremendous amount of courage to walk that middle path. And the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, dukkha, requires that we look the reality of conditioned existence in the face, as it actually is. And even more broadly speaking, the paramita of satya, truth, which includes speaking the truth and being truthful to others, but more fundamentally it includes being truthful with yourself, facing the truth. And this can be difficult, to not see things as we wish they were, as we think they ought to be, but to see things as they actually are. Now, this is truthfulness, and it requires a courageous spirit to be present with actual reality as it actually is. It's one of the stages in the path, is yasabhutananadasana, knowledge and vision of things as they actually are. And that's when the mind begins to open up to the fundamental reality of existence. And that can be painful. And there's a temptation in the mind to retreat from that, to put the rose-colored glasses back on. In the stages of insight, which is a system, it's found in the suttas in very cursory form, without elaboration, but it was developed extensively in the commentarial tradition, and the best modern exposition of it is by Mahasi Sayadaw. The various stages the mind goes through in vipassana, finally culminating in the realization of the unconditioned, into awakening bodhi. Once the mind has seen the reality of things, then it can go through a difficult passage. The meditator will experience the loss and despair and fearfulness, realizing that there's nothing to be relied on whatsoever in the conditioned world. This, I think, is parallel or similar to what the Christian mystic tradition calls the dark night of the soul. I've also seen it poetically alluded to as the ogre under the bridge, and that the way out is down and through. These states of mind have to be confronted and got through to the other side. This is stepping into the stream with no support. And the difficulty and unpleasantness of this experience is prolonged by cowardice. The person can sometimes take a long time to go through this because they can't bear to face it, and they retreat back into the false comforts of the near shore. But facing that reality is the only way through to the unconditioned, to finding the mind that is boundless, luminous, and finds no footing. Overcoming fearfulness is a key ingredient. In the Thai forest tradition, it's often practiced to meditate in lonely places and in the jungle where there might be wild animals, where there's actual danger, or where there's a psychic fearfulness, like in a burning ground, a cremation ground. Ajahn Chah writes about this, or talked about this in his recollections of his early years when he was a young monk, and he meditated in a cremation ground. And culturally, Thais are very concerned about ghosts. It's a really big deal in their culture, the fear of ghosts. And a cremation ground would be particularly difficult for a young monk just kind of starting out. And he said he was so afraid. He heard noises, and it was probably just like dogs or something, but he heard noises, and it terrified him so much he stayed in his gloat. He was afraid to go out, and he needed to urinate, but he didn't dare leave his gloat. And in the morning, he had strained himself so much that when he did urinate, blood came out. And the idea of going into to these places is to confront that fear and overcome it. As well as when there's actual danger, it does encourage alertness and mindfulness. It is quite a useful spice to the mind. The kind of good news is that we, as Dhamma practitioners and human beings, we have the potential. We can do it. It's one of the characteristics of human beings in which they surpass the devas. There's a list of ways in which humans surpass the devas, and one of them is in courage. That human beings have the capacity for courage. That we can rouse that spirit. And overcoming fearfulness and finding courage has a lot to do with overcoming the idea of self. Because in the end, fearfulness is based on a self view. And this is why the Arahant is completely free of fear, because he's completely free of self. When we feel afraid for any reason, whether it's something like social anxiety or whether it's something like a physical danger or whatever it might be, it's because of some idea of a threat to the self. That there's this self position that must be maintained in some way. And if one abandons the thought of self, then there's nothing to be afraid of. But as long as we're clinging to an idea of protecting, saving the self in some way, then we're going to experience fear. And we're unable to practice the kind of radical abandonment that needs to be done. In one of the discourses of the Buddha, he's sitting with the monks in a park, and in the middle distance they can see some people from the village have come to gather firewood sticks. And the Buddha says to the monks, "Do you see, O monks, those villagers over there gathering bundles of sticks and carrying them away?" "Yes, we see that." "When you see the sticks being carried away, do you weep and wail and beat your breast and cry, 'Oh no, where are they taking those sticks?'" The monks are kind of puzzled by this statement and like, "No, Lord, no. Why should we care? It's nothing to do with us." And the Buddha says, that attitude you have towards the sticks, that's the attitude you should have towards this body, towards feelings, towards perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. This is that radical abandonment of attachment to the khandhas. Fear arises because of attachment. We're attached to the body, so we're afraid of change in the body, and yet the body is constantly undergoing alteration and aging, is subject to sickness and death and injury. And this happens all the time. We're afraid of the feelings being hurt, or feeling sad, or feeling lonely, or whatever it might be. But the feelings changing all the time. They're like soap bubbles. They're not me, not mine. The same with all of the aggregates. There's nowhere to be found in anything that's secure, safe, not subject to change, not subject to alteration, decay, and loss. And we can't change that. We can't make them safe and secure. But we can abandon that unrealistic wish. And courage is related to the quality of perseverance and steadiness on the path. To have that attitude of, in spite of any obstacle, to continue. There's a cartoon that I saw once in a Buddhist magazine. It was a long series of small panels, and it was like going through a person's life. And it starts like a little kid, too young, and then it was, as he gets older, too busy, too much in love, too sick, too old, and finally there's a gravestone, too late. Now, that's a very short version. It was like, I don't know, about 16 or 20 panels. And there is a sutta like that where the Buddha's talking about people's excuses for not practicing. It's too hot, so he doesn't practice. It's too cold, so he doesn't practice. He's too hungry, so he doesn't practice. He's too full, so he doesn't practice. That we can always find some reason, some excuse. And the truth is, you're never going to find ideal conditions because there are no ideal conditions. They're always something that could be better in any condition. But we make do with what the conditions we have. And we have the courage not to make excuses, not making excuses for the defilements, not giving into the defilements. And that does take that kind of a warrior spirit. Ajahn Mahabua, in his youth, before he became a monk, he was he was a, I don't know, amateur or semi-pro boxer. And I don't know if you know, Thai boxing is brutal. They use the feet as well. People get killed in Thai boxing on a fairly regular basis. And he gave one Dhamma talk where he was using boxing metaphor for beating up on the defilements, and I kicked ignorance as hard as I could, and he fell to the mat. And he never gets up again. In Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva of wisdom is Manjusri, and his image he's got in his left hand is on his lap holding an open book, and his right hand is wielding a sword over his head. And this image of wielding the sword is, cutting off of the defilements. And there's an element like that in Vipassana meditation. When things arise in the mind, they're seen sharply. It's like cutting them off. I've compared it to being at the county fair and shooting ducks, the wooden ducks that go by in this game, and you shoot them with an air pistol or an air rifle. It's like that. Objects arise in the mind, and you penetrate them with insight, knock them down. And that requires courage as well, because one of the real fundamental difficulties in doing Vipassana properly is people's either attachment or aversion to various mental states. And they kind of nurse it along. They coddle their defilements instead of seeing through them and seeing it just as a objective Dhamma rising and falling. They have that fierce glare, that eye of Vipassana, the clear seeing, is in some ways it's a fierce glare. It's a take no prisoners kind of attitude. So I guess to sum it up, I could say that the path and the goal are not for the faint-hearted.